Right now, we only have 4 healthy tight ends that are averaging double-digit fantasy points per game. And then you have a few tight ends after that are averaging anywhere between 9.5 and 8 fantasy points per game. And then after that, it's basically a round robin of who can I throw into my lineup that won't lose me my week. Even though the tight end position seems to be like a dice roll every single week, unless you have one of those top 4 guys, watching these videos right here will definitely help you make the best decision possible for your team. Yo, what is going on, Headliner Nation? Hopefully everybody is doing well out there, and I know who is definitely doing well. It's people that have Travis Kelce, George Kittle, TJ Hockenson, and Sam Laporta on their fantasy teams. Everybody else, every single week, keeps questioning themselves on who you should have in at the tight end position. And in today's video, I'm going to be breaking down the tight ends in every single matchup on the NFL slate for Week 15. So go ahead and hit that like button for me. Subscribe to the channel if you're new here and turn on the bell notification so anytime we go live or drop new content, you'll know about it right away. But for now, let's head into Thursday Night Football. And who are going to be the first what-ifs at the tight end position this week? Over the last 3 weeks, Gerald Everett has been okay. In those last 3 games, the lowest amount of fantasy points he's given you is 6.5 fantasy points. So while the upside hasn't really been there for him, things could end up changing this week with Easton Stick taking over at quarterback for Justin Herbert. Who's he going to be looking to? Who's going to be that check down guy? We know Keenan Allen is probably going to get a lot of looks as usual, but will Gerald Everett kind of be that next guy up? Will it be Austin Eckler? Does Stick try to push the ball down the field and maybe get Quentin Johnson some targets? There's a lot of question marks this week. Normally in this type of a situation, I would say starting a tight end that has a backup young quarterback coming into the starting role could end up being a good thing because he'll see some targets as he tries to get rid of the ball quickly, especially towards the beginning of the game. But because it's Gerald Everett, you already have Keenan Allen and Austin Eckler. I really don't know if we're feeling that good about this one. But Gerald Everett could end up giving you that 6.5 point floor once again. After scoring less than 10 fantasy points in 2 of his last 3 games, TJ Hockenson could be in line for one of those huge bangers this week going up against Cincinnati. The Bengals are currently ranked 27th against the pass and allowing the most fantasy points to the tight end position this season. But the Vikings are making a change at the quarterback position, going with Nick Mullins over Joshua Dobbs. And the biggest question will end up being, what does TJ Hockenson's target share look like with a new quarterback and Justin Jefferson saying that he will play again this week? Those are some questions that, while they might scare us about the ceiling just a little bit, it's not nearly enough to drive us off one of the best tight ends in all of football, especially from a fantasy perspective. TJ Hockenson already survived the injury to Kirk Cousins and Josh Dobbs coming in. I'm sure in this offense, he'll also survive the switch over to Nick Mullins. TJ Hockenson will end up being one of my top 2 tight ends again this week. Now, Tanner Hudson, a guy I talked about quite a bit weeks back, even before Joe Burrow went down with his injury, is kind of a up and riser in that Bengals offense, finally scored a touchdown this past week, something that we've been looking for prior to this, because a lot of people may have picked him up and then already dropped him. So if you're thinking about running back towards him, I'm probably not going to do it just yet. We'll continue to eye it, and maybe if he strings together another good performance here in Week 15, he could be a streaming option to end the season. But more than likely, we'll just finish it off with some guys that present a lot less risk. Pat Freiermuth has only really given us one good game since returning from the IR, and we know that him and Kenny Pickett are boys, and we know when those two are on the field together that more than likely Pat Freiermuth is going to be getting plenty of looks. But unfortunately, Kenny Pickett doesn't have an estimated return date as of right now and will miss once again this week. I said my concerns last week about Mitchell Trubisky being under center and not having the same connection with Freiermuth. And even though he did have 7 targets, which was tied for the team lead, he only caught 2 of those for 18 yards. I still have a lot of concerns about Mitchell Trubisky being able to get the ball to Pat Freiermuth on a regular basis to make him fantasy viable. Now, the good news is this matchup is going to be right in the wheelhouse to get Pat Freiermuth back to fantasy relevancy. Because even though the Indianapolis Colts are ranked 17th against the pass, right kind of in the middle right now, they do allow the 7th most fantasy points to the tight end position. And seeing as how Trubisky was getting the ball towards Pat Freiermuth last week, even if they all weren't catchable, at least there's a thought that he will go that way once again this week. Is the ceiling there for me? It could be, especially if he finds the end zone, obviously at the tight end position. And if he gets another 7 targets, he's absolutely going to have one of the better ceilings on the week outside of those top 4 tight ends that we see up there on a weekly occurrence. But the floor is super risky for me this week because Mitchell Trubisky could be throwing ducks more than TDs. Overall, the Broncos defense has improved greatly over the last few weeks and made a huge turnaround since the beginning of the season when they were putting together one of the most historically bad defensive seasons that we have ever seen. And they are becoming more competitive and even just a game out of leading the AFC West now. This is going to be a big matchup going up against Detroit. And even though their pass defense has been much better, going up against tight ends, they still have allowed the 2nd most fantasy points on the season and the 2nd most receiving yards to tight ends over the last 4 weeks. So while they have improved as a whole, that is still one area that they're getting beat up in. And Sam Laporta is one of the best tight ends in taking advantage of those weak defenses. I'm definitely expecting some big numbers from Sam Laporta this week in a game where Detroit has to win. Hayden Hurst is still unfortunately dealing with symptoms from a concussion a couple of weeks ago, and no word on when he'll actually be able to return, even though he's trying to make his way back. Jonnu Smith has scored less than 8 fantasy points total over his last 4 games, which means the only guy to talk about in this matchup is going to be Kyle Pitts. And he did score a touchdown last week, meaning that Sam Laporta still has more career touchdowns than what Kyle Pitts does, which is just a funny observation and stat that I like to throw out there. But Kyle Pitts continues to be completely erratic and unreliable on our fantasy teams. The Carolina Panthers, for as bad as they are really everywhere on this team, they're pretty darn good against the pass, allowing the 3rd fewest passing yards in the NFL and only the 8th fewest fantasy points to the tight end position. Now, Kyle Pitts doesn't really play the tight end position, but lining up out wide isn't going to be any easier for him going up against this secondary. For me, Kyle Pitts, I've seen him score points in kind of these short stretches before, where maybe he has 2 good games in a row or 2 out of 3 good games or something like that. So who knows, maybe he has another decent game. But let's be honest, if you own Kyle Pitts, you probably weren't even in the playoffs. In the Chicago and Cleveland matchup, we do have a couple of potentially good options. Cole Kmet had another decent game going up against Detroit this past week, and it could have been even bigger had he secured a touchdown in the corner of the end zone that was just barely missed between him and Justin Fields. But this is a really tough Cleveland defense, ranked number 1 against the pass and allowing the 2nd fewest fantasy points to the tight end position this year. Unfortunately, there is the potential that they're going to get after Justin Fields this week, and he's not going to have the time to set his feet and look for Cole Kmet down the field. And Cole Kmet could even be locked up on himself. So for him this week, there is always an opportunity kind of being the number 1 outlet outside of DJ Moore for Justin Fields. But there's always such a risk with such a low floor with an offense that just doesn't seem to put together consistent performances. The last time David Njoku scored less than 8 fantasy points was back in week 6. And this past week with a huge game scoring 24 points, he entered the 20-point club for tight ends this season, which is pretty exclusive because only 5 other tight ends have scored 20 or more half PPR points in a game so far this year. So with the change over to Joe Flacco, it looks like he's still going to be looking David Njoku's way quite a bit, which is great because when there's been the back and forth with Deshaun Watson and the backup quarterbacks the last couple of years, the backup quarterbacks have always looked towards David Njoku more often. Then Deshaun Watson kind of forgets about him. But with Joe Flacco, there was a little bit of a worry that Flacco's a savvy vet. He might not need to dump it off. He might not need that safety valve that David Njoku really can be in this offense, and he'd be willing to air it out a little bit more often. Well, he still looked his way quite a bit. 2 touchdowns last week. And if David Njoku can be a top 5 tight end the rest of the way, he's going to make some fantasy owners some serious cash to end the season. Tampa Bay and Green Bay bring a couple of what I like to call high risk but low reward plays, meaning that obviously they're going to bring you a lot of risk because they haven't been consistent in any way, shape, or form this season. And when you talk about their low upside, if it's high risk, high upside, you know that you're gambling on a lot of points potentially, but also it could turn out to be really bad. With these gambles, it's like putting $1,000 down on your ticket on a bet, but your best return is going to be $1,015. Is it really worth it to win $15? Cade Otton, probably the safest one in this matchup because we know he plays more snaps than any tight end in football. And he's getting a good matchup going up against the Green Bay Packers that do allow tight ends to score on them. Cade Otton's going to be a really nice streaming option down the stretch for those of you that have been unable to find any decent plays for a while at the tight end position or not a whole lot of consistency. Tucker Kraft is being added to the slide in place of Luke Musgrave because we still don't know when Musgrave is going to be back. But it feels like Tucker Kraft has actually been targeted on a more consistent basis over the last few weeks than what Musgrave was this entire season. And once again, it's a good matchup for him as well. He could absolutely shine. And even though I don't think he has a lot of touchdown potential in this matchup, I do think if he were to get like 5 targets, catching 3 or 4 of those for 40 to 50 yards could end up putting you right in the 7 to 8 fantasy point mark. I know there are some people out there that really want Tyler Conklin to be a thing. And there were some times this season where I thought he possibly could be. But think about this. Zach Wilson looked like an all-pro last week. I mean, he looked like a completely different quarterback than we've seen since he became a starter in the NFL. And Tyler Conklin still couldn't even manage to get 8 fantasy points. So when I take a look at the upside from Conklin, it just isn't there. Because how often do you really expect to get all-pro Zach Wilson? Is it going to happen again going up against Miami? I just don't feel like it. And because of that, Tyler Conklin doesn't even have nearly enough upside for me to risk it. I'd rather risk it for somebody that has the same floor as Tyler Conklin, but does bring a higher upside. The Giants and Saints matchup is really going to be a wait-and-see approach for Taysom Hill. As of this recording, he had returned to practice, but there was no definitive answer yet on whether or not he would end up playing this week. But if he's returning to practice, it does look like that he has a good shot to face the New York Giants. Now, last week, before we found out that he was going to be out for the week and that Derek Carr was going to end up playing, he was lining up to be a super safe bet, something we don't say very often around here about Taysom Hill because of all the snaps that he was likely going to get at the quarterback position. And given the Saints' offensive struggles last week against the Minnesota Vikings, I want to be willing to bet that we're also going to see some Taysom Hill at quarterback again this week. Now, the reason he is in yellow right now is because we still don't know for sure if he's going to be playing. As the week goes on and we find out that Hill will be in, I will still be willing to bump him up to green, even though the New York Giants allow the 3rd fewest fantasy points to tight ends. Taysom Hill isn't a tight end, but I think we'll see him on the field enough, and they're going to get him mixed in enough to be one of the safer bets here in the first week of the fantasy playoffs. All right, we've got a lot of question marks in the Houston and Tennessee matchup. As of right now, it does appear Dalton Schultz has returned to practice, and even though he did some limited stuff last week, he still was not able to go. So there's no clear-cut answer yet on whether or not he will be able to go this week. Now, we know Nico Collins left the game early last week with an issue. We know Noah Brown has been banged up. We know that Tank Dell is gone for the rest of the year, and CJ Stroud still has not practiced yet this week, so it could end up being Davis Mills. So for all of those reasons combined, if Dalton Schultz ends up playing, but there's no CJ Stroud, it's really going to be a toss-up because if there's no Nico Collins either, who are they realistically going to target consistently? I would definitely see Dalton Schultz having a decent game. If Nico Collins were to return and there is a backup, then still at that point, he could see a few less targets. Some could go to Nico Collins. He could still have a decent floor. And then if everyone were to be healthy and fine by the end of the week, then hooray, Dalton Schultz goes back to being a pretty easy start for me. But because so many questions are not answered as of this recording, we're going to have to go ahead and say sorry to Dalton Schultz for right now. We can't say that you're a safe play as of yet, so you're going to be right in the middle until we know more. Chigioka would end up being in red this week if it weren't for the fact that the Houston Texans allow the third most fantasy points to the tight end position. Some decent volume last week, not a big game going up against Miami, even though I'm surprised they were not throwing to him a little bit more often. But even with that being said, this is one of those matchups where once again we have to ask ourselves, is Chigioka worth it? Now remember a couple of minutes ago when I talked about Tyler Conklin and I said he doesn't have that much upside and that there's other tight ends with more upside but the same floor as him? That would be this guy right here, Chigioka, because he does have about the same, maybe 5, 6, 7 point floor, but it could go anywhere as high as maybe 11, 10, somewhere in that area if he can definitely get himself up around 6 or 7 targets. I know. Travis Kelce has not given you the upside that you would have wanted from a first or a second round pick this season. But as far as the tight end position goes, he's given you 4 straight performances with double-digit points, and he has at least double-digit points in all but 3 of his games this season, and his lowest point total outside of a 2-point performance is 7.7 points. So he's still one of the most consistent tight ends, and actually probably still the most consistent tight end in all of football. So go ahead and enjoy the last couple of weeks here, because quite honestly, Travis Kelce could end up hanging it up at the end of the season. And I do know for a fact that his ADP will be nowhere near what it was last year either. So you know what? Just go ahead and take the safety here in the playoffs and be okay with it. Now, Hunter Henry had 2 touchdowns this past week. And as somebody that had Hunter Henry listed as a sleeper candidate at the tight end position this year in our draft guide, you won't find anybody that's more excited to see those type of performances. It's just really too bad that those performances came after weeks of absolutely nothing, so nobody was starting him anyway. Couple of comments came in about, hey, great call on Hunter Henry. And I was like, you find me the guy that said to put Hunter Henry in your fantasy lineup, and I'll give the guy $10. It wasn't really out there last week. And going up against Kansas City, maybe we find it this week. If Kansas City has a good game and can get out in front of New England and they have to throw it, maybe Zappe and Henry can be on the same page once again. But he's in red. Because he's risky, because more times than not this season, he's done absolutely nothing for us. So does he have touchdown potential once again? Yes, he does. But the floor is super, super low with him. There were a few games deserving of the Manscaped must-watch matchup of the week, and San Francisco and Arizona were one of those. And even though I gave that privilege to another matchup, this one is still going to be really good. George Kittle has one of the highest ceilings, as usual, at the tight end position, and going up against Arizona, he is going to have it once again this week. My biggest concern this week is that San Francisco beats the brakes off of Arizona, though, and because of that, there isn't just a whole lot of passing going on. We get maybe Debo worked in a little bit, Christian McCaffrey runs all over the place, Brandon Ayuk has a big play, and George Kittle sees a few nice passes, but not really enough to reach the ceiling that we would like. I could see that happening. I could also see George Kittle scoring twice in the first half as well. So he's still going to be one of my top tight end plays of the week, but he's going to have kind of that risky floor like every other tight end does. But he's in green because we know the ceiling is super high every single week. And Trey McBride has a super high ceiling as well. But unfortunately, he doesn't play in an offense that is as good as San Francisco. And unfortunately, he's playing up against a defense like San Francisco. So even though he is maybe the main pass catcher on this offense right now and could see a lot of targets, there's a lot of risk associated with, is he going to be a top 5 tight end or is he going to be down towards 15 because San Francisco just shuts it down? After Tyler Higbee was inactive and Hunter Long went down with an injury, Davis Allen stepped in and played great. 50 receiving yards and a touchdown. But this week, Tyler Higbee is expected back, and that's the reports earlier in the week, and that obviously could end up changing. But if Tyler Higbee is back this week, it's going to be him. Davis Allen isn't going to have a whole lot of fantasy value, and I still don't even think that I'm willing to run with Tyler Higbee this week, because even if he does come back, because of how well Davis Allen played, maybe they try to split snaps with him and continue to get him out on the field and give Tyler Higbee another week to fully heal up. So right now I'm staying away from the Rams tight ends in this matchup, but Logan Thomas, I'm definitely going to be all over Logan Thomas this week. The Rams have allowed 7 touchdowns to tight ends this season, which is tied for the most in the league. And even though Logan Thomas doesn't have a great weekly ceiling and only a pretty decent weekly floor, the fact that we're adding in such a juicy matchup for him to find the end zone means we got to get him back in our lineup once again. He's obviously going to bring risk because once again, you've got Terry McLaurin, you've got Curtis Samuel, you've got Jahan Dotson, you've got Antonio Gibson out of the backfield. We're still not 100% sure if Brian Robinson is going to play. So there's a lot of players to potentially try and get targets to, but the only targets I care about are those end zone targets. And if he can find that touchdown this week, he should find himself inside the top 12 tight ends. Jake Ferguson's performances this year really define the tight end position. Coming out of the bye, he had 3 straight games with double-digit performances, and he looked to finally be breaking out and getting the targets I was begging the Cowboys to give to him. And then he had back-to-back games with only 4 fantasy points. But then he got back to double-digit fantasy points. Let's go, Jake Ferguson's back. And then back down under 10. Still a good game. It was like 9.5, but it wasn't the upside that we were looking for. But that's really what it continues to be with Jake Ferguson this year. And even though Buffalo does a pretty good job at stopping tight ends, I'm still willing to bet on a Dallas Cowboys offense and Dak Prescott that are absolutely rolling right now. I mean, if you were to look at the MVP race, you could make a case for Dak Prescott. You can make a case for Brock Purdy. I really still think Tyreek Hill needs to be mentioned a little bit more as well. But with this clash here and an offensive matchup where we're probably going to see the ball whipped around quite a bit, I'm willing to bet on Jake Ferguson's floor this week. Now, with the return of Dawson Knox this past week, we did see a pretty big dip, all the way down to 4 fantasy points for Dalton Kincaid, but he still had 8 targets, second most on the team. So Josh Allen is still going to be looking his way. And going up against his pass rush from the Dallas Cowboys, Josh Allen is going to be looking to get rid of the ball pretty quickly. I don't see a huge ceiling this week for Dalton Kincaid. I do expect Dallas's defense to be ready to go in this matchup, have Josh Allen on the move, and I also expect Josh Allen to try and get on the same page with Stefon Diggs once again this week. So for me, not a great ceiling for Dalton Kincaid this week, but if Josh Allen gets on the move and is able to dump it off to him a few times, it could be enough targets to push him back to about 6 or 7 fantasy points. Baltimore and Jacksonville is going to bring my Manscaped must-watch matchup for the week at the tight end position. With Christmas right around the corner, this is your last chance to grab those stocking stuffers and anything that you want to slip under the tree for that special someone this year. Head on over to manscaped.com. Use code word headliners when you check out. You're going to get 20% off your entire order and free shipping. Now, Isaiah Likely's big week this past week was really made on one blown play. He just happened to slip by coverage and the defenders were busy doing something else. And that happens from time to time, and I'm not trying to discount that because he still has 13 total targets over his last 2 games. So even though his big fantasy points really came on one big play, he's still seeing a decent amount of volume. And in this matchup going up against Jacksonville, I have to assume we're going to see around 6 or 7 targets once again for Isaiah Likely. And on top of that, Jacksonville allows the 5th most fantasy points to the tight end position. So the volume could absolutely be there this week, but the touchdown could also come as well. Over the last 3 games, Evan Engram has seen 8, 9, and 12 targets, and 12 targets this past week, tied for a season high for Evan Engram. And missing Christian Kirk is definitely going to be a big reason why. And even though Baltimore has been successful against tight ends this year, I am going to go with Evan Engram to see a heavy dosage of targets once again. Because when you lose arguably your safest target, Trevor Lawrence and Christian Kirk worked really well together. Calvin Ridley was way too up and down. Evan Ingram had a safe floor every single week. We knew the guy was going to be right around probably tight end 14 or 12. But now with the increased visibility because of no Christian Kirk, it is allowing him to push up towards that mid tight end 1 status a little bit more, especially in a matchup where Jacksonville probably has to throw the ball because Baltimore is going to come ready to play. Last week, I got a lot of Dallas Goedert questions, and I'm willing to bet I'm going to get a lot of them this week as well. But I'm still not really sure that he's 100%. My biggest concern last week is that he was more of a decoy being used to help open up the outside part of the field for A.J. Brown and Devontae Smith. And I think that was true to a certain extent. Now, he did catch all 4 of his targets for a pedestrian 30 yards. So not a super big day, but not a day that absolutely killed you either if you did end up needing to play him. But there was still 13 targets to A.J. Brown and 10 to Devontae Smith, and then Dallas Goedert at only 4 targets. And my worry is that the same thing is going to happen this week, that they're going to have him out there and maybe he's still not 100% yet. And they find him being more of a guy that they're trying to utilize to open up things for the guys on the outside. So for me personally, I'm kind of looking at 4 to maybe 6 targets this week and maybe around that 40-yard reception mark as well. I'm really not banking on a whole lot more than that. Is it possible? Absolutely. But me personally, I would love to give it another week before I tried to jump on the bandwagon of starting Dallas Goedert once again. All right, Headliner Nation, there you have it. My tight end breakdown for every matchup on the Week 15 slate. Hopefully this information is able to help you set your lineups, but if you still have questions, our rankings will come out on Thursday. Hit the like button for me, subscribe if you're new here, turn on the bell notifications, and ladies and gentlemen, I appreciate every single one of you. I'll catch you on the next episode of the Fantasy Headliners.